Take a vehicle. It doesn't really matter whether it's a ship, plane, submarine, torpedo, cruise missile. Take another one just like it and get it to go half the distance but at twice the speed. How much more or less fuel does the second one that does the short sprint require? Is it a quarter? Half? Roughly the same? Double? Or 4 times as much fuel? Now, why does this question really matter? Well, I think it matters a lot because it actually poses a tension between, I think, what are the 2 most popular things that defense analysts and commentators generally call for: range and speed. Of course, these are both highly desirable to have forces that are more prompt in their response, more agile, that have greater reach, that can strike in depth. But when we ask for those, what is the costs? How much of this good thing can we afford before we give up too much of other good things? As it turns out, you only need 3 simple equations to basically completely tie together the relationship between a vehicle's speed, its size, its range, its payload, and also give a pretty good guide to how much it costs. And that, I think, matters a lot for the quality of debate we have about military affairs. The other reason is that it's important for people to know this is because every now and again, major countries have to make crucial decisions about how they structure their forces and what major acquisitions they make. And every now and again, they get caught up in a massive, messy, twisted situation where they go in with expectations that actually can't be met realistically. And the most spectacular recent example of this was the cancellation of the Australian French-designed Attack Class Submarine. This had massive ripples around the world. The political fallout is arguably still going on. It was an incredibly awkward, cringe-worthy cancellation moment where Australia didn't even really let the French know they were about to do it. That embarrassed the United States. Ambassadors everywhere got recalled. And basically everything about that extremely awkward cancellation can be easily explained because in 2018, Defence actually admitted they thought that one of these 3 equations didn't apply to their submarine project. And that explains basically everything. Now, these equations don't just matter to commentators. They're also really important for people that are actually signing checks for massive projects. This is huge. This is probably the biggest project failure and cancellation of the 21st century, I would say. So it's a big deal, I think, whichever way you care to measure it. There were massive political and diplomatic ramifications. A whole bunch of diplomats got recalled.
A not-so-happy family photo. A pair of presidents exchanging pleasantries with one Prime Minister feeling a bit left out.
You think he lied to you?
I don't think. I know.
He said that you might have lied. Is that true?
No.
I don't wish to personalise this. There's no element of that from my perspective. I must say that I think the statements that were made questioning Australia's integrity and the slurs that have been placed on Australia.
Now, to be honest, I think there were some odd sounding things about this program from very, very early stages. What was odd about it? First, I think we could start with the size of the submarine. This went totally underreported, right? So the 2016 white paper, which was just before the procurement, the competitive evaluation process of these submarines, stated that we need a submarine of similar range and capabilities to the Collins class. The proposal that came out from DCNS at the time, and then Naval Group, they changed their name, it proposed a submarine that was going to be like basically an extra 1,500 or 2,000 tons larger than the Collins class submarine. It's as though a Collins class submarine swallowed an entire European submarine. Crew, engines, batteries, everything, weapons, and came out with capabilities much like the Collins class submarine. That went completely unnoticed. Everyone's kind of like, wow, it's a big submarine. Absolutely no questioning why it was such a massive step up in size. The next interesting thing to note is, what about the price? Now, there was a report that came out of ASPE a few years before the submarine program really got kicked off in earnest, and it was done by a smart guy called Andrew Davies, who I've got a lot of time for. And he did an extrapolation of the historical kind of prices of submarines, and he estimated that our submarines would cost something like $36 billion. When the number came out and was announced at $50 billion for the French proposal, everyone was kind of like, wow, well that's even more. That's an expensive submarine, but well, okay, it's kind of in the ballpark. And nothing more was thought of until a little while later, when people realized the way that inflation was treated was not what people initially thought. So it wasn't actually going to be the $50 billion number. In the terms that we thought we were reporting it, it was going to be more like $80 or $90 billion acquisition. So it's kind of crazy that we were ready to pay that much, and the budget wasn't particularly well explained. Again, we thought we'd asked for a submarine that had similar range and capabilities to the Collins, except for upgraded electronics, of course, and we got a massively bigger and more expensive submarine. The third thing that was really weird about that project at the start was the schedule. We had the Collins class that would need to start being retired 2026 onwards, because the oldest boats would basically have reached their life of type. Without a major overhaul and extension, they might start becoming unsafe to basically use. So that was the agenda, to start getting new ones delivered around that time frame, and the French proposal was way longer. Early 2030s was the best they could pin it down. But perhaps the most strange thing about the Attack Class Submarine was the manner in which it was cancelled. Now this, I think, caught everyone by surprise. A whole bunch of insiders in Canberra were kind of like, wow, they kept that quiet. We didn't see that coming. So obviously credit to Scott Morrison and the government for managing to keep it quiet, but then it turns out that France was completely blindsided by it and had no idea, and were absolutely howling and fuming in protest, not only at Australia but at the United States and the UK for agreeing to join up and do nuclear submarines together. And I think that is kind of interesting that we said, yeah, all of a sudden we've realized we want a nuclear submarine, and France, who are modifying a nuclear submarine to make a diesel-electric submarine, weren't invited, weren't told. There was no kind of thought about, oh, why don't we convert this to a nuclear submarine? We're just done here, and not even going to give you a polite goodbye and a really nice explanation. It was going to be pretty rude kind of cut and run to the new partners. That's bizarre. Why didn't we just ask France to go back to the nuclear version, or at least talk to them about that? Turns out that all these strange things, I think they can be explained. I kind of do have a background in this, because I was actually providing some evidence to the Senate, a Senate inquiry on shipbuilding, and they requested me to provide a report that I'd written for an independent little think tank in Australia. And I presented that to the Senate, and they found it credible, and they directed Defence to respond. And Defence basically did not respond in the prescribed time. They waited until that inquiry was completely closed. They waited another 6 weeks or so, and then they came out with a response. And this is a response to Parliament, like it's a pretty serious thing. It's a question on notice from a Senate inquiry.
I'm wondering, what are you seeking from this committee in terms of the propositions you're putting before us?
Look, I'm just offering my evidence here. To me, it seems that the pump jet is strange. I find it difficult to believe that this is the primary design feature that we have knowingly and deliberately selected. Whatever has led to that, I just suggest this committee needs to get to the bottom of why it was selected, because it doesn't seem consistent with building a world-class submarine, and it seems like we could be heading on a track that could lead to a real procurement mess. So I would just direct your focus at figuring out how we got here, because if the forces that put such a strange engineering choice into the submarine are still at work, there could be worse to come in the future, and it doesn't bode well for a successful procurement. I think there is like a $2.5 billion acquisition train wreck that is on the line here. We can actually explain that sort of stuff, and we can prevent that sort of stuff if people knew these kind of three really basic equations that most people would be able to do in their head or the back of an envelope and get right, or right enough to make smart decisions in 5 or 10 minutes. Equation number 1. This is the definition of work. Now, what's work? Why does this matter? Well, work matters because it's basically a definition of energy. I like to think of it as the very bare minimum fuel bill the laws of physics will send you for moving an object. And the way it's calculated is basically you just need to multiply the force that you need to push that object, multiply that by the distance over which you apply that force to push it, and then you get the amount of work. And that's in joules. It's a simple calculation of energy. So force in newtons times distance in meters, and you get the amount of work done. Now the full explanation says there's a little bit more to it, okay? The actual equation involves an integral of f dot ds, all right? So the dot ds means that if the force changes at the time that you're actually pushing, or the speed changes, you've got to integrate it over that particular moment that you're pushing it. Also, the dot there, that means there's a dot product. So if you're pushing not in the direction you're moving, then not all the force of push kind of gets included in the equation, okay? So that might matter quite a bit for things like helicopters or hovercraft that push mostly down and move forward. So they're wasting a lot of effort not doing work because they're not actually moving up, they're just sort of staying still up. They're just pushing down but moving forward, and then they add some force backwards. That's the force that you need to do to use this equation properly. So that's a particular area where there could be a little bit of a variation required. Hovercraft and helicopters are the only ones where there's a bit of an expected variation there. So that's a pretty simple equation, really easy, basically force times distance. So why on earth am I telling you about this seemingly simple equation, which kind of seems a little bit obvious? And that's because there's a trap. There's a really easy pitfall that loads of people make, and that is to try to think about the amount of energy required in a time kind of frame of reference, all right? And the temptation here is to think that because I'm going faster, I only have to work for less time, so therefore I'll save a bit of energy, right? And if you calculate the power, which is the energy expended per time, you could get that right, but it's really easy to make some mistakes or have some intuitions that lead you to the wrong place. Basically, the best frame of reference is always distance, and it's because of this equation. F dot ds is a really good way of calculating the minimum amount of energy to move any object. How do you calculate that F? Well, guess what? There's one beautiful equation which tells you in almost every circumstance how you can calculate that F. It's called the drag equation. So this drag equation has a few bits to it. The first one I'm going to focus on, because it is easily the most important, is that v squared there. That v squared means velocity of the thing that's moving. So if you're moving at a constant speed, the amount of force you need to keep moving at that constant speed, which is the analysis you generally always want to do, is squared to get the force. Now that's a crazy, crazy cruel relationship, because that means if you want to go like 40% faster, you need to double your fuel bill to move the same distance. You don't get to go like, a bit further because you're going fast, took less time. You double the fuel bill for the same distance, all right? The other corollary of that, which is kind of crazy, is that if you do want to calculate power, because you're a time reference kind of guy and you want to get back to that, then you can actually calculate the power really easily. It scales with velocity cubed. That means that if you want to say double your speed, the power you need to output from your engines in a unit of time is 8 times bigger. Not double, 8 times more power out of your engines. This is a really cruel relationship, and I think this is the first one, number one equation, that I wish other analysts just had front of mind when they're talking about defense acquisitions. Going a little bit faster costs you a lot more fuel. It's not a little bit faster, a little bit more fuel. A little bit leads to a lot. What's a lot? It's velocity squared. That's an important thing to get. The other parts of this equation are relatively easy to wrap your head around. There is A, which is the surface area. That's crucial because that'll feed into our third equation here, and that has a big role to play. Then of course there's rho, which is the density of the fluid that you're moving through, okay? That means that underwater, obviously you encounter a lot more drag because water is very, very roughly 1,000 times as dense as air. And of course, if you go up into the outer parts of the atmosphere, you get a bit less drag too. If you go to outer space, you have no drag and you can just keep going ad infinitum without any more energy being required. So those are the key simple parts of the equation. So there's only really kind of one interesting trick there left, which is really worth talking about. And that's this C, or CD. There's a little subscript there generally. And this is what we'd call the drag coefficient. And basically, the creators of this equation in science, they decided they would shove all the complex bits into this one factor. So the other bits they hold, and all the complicated stuff about exactly what type of drag and the movements of fluids and laminar and turbulent flow, that is basically stuffed into the CD here, all right? CD in lots of circumstances is a constant and it stays the same. To get into what this is, you need to understand, I think, really just two key concepts about fluid flow. One is laminar flow and the other one is turbulent flow. Turbulent flow basically is where this equation will apply reliably all the time. If you have turbulent flow around a body, this is the equation that works. The drag coefficient will stay the same. You can also think about beach volleyball. I play beach volleyball, I love beach volleyball, and beach volleyball players, although they never will tell you this because they don't know it, they love playing with the boundary between laminar and turbulent flow. They use it all the time. It's in this serve, it's called a float serve, right? And the idea is that basically you don't put any spin on the ball and you just let it kind of go straight over the net. And the reason that is so effective is because it happens that for something about volleyball size, moving at something like volleyball speed over the net, you're kind of close to this boundary point where flow might turn turbulent, but it might not be turbulent, it could stay laminar. And the amount of drag that occurs on the volleyball can actually change mid-flight. It can suddenly switch to turbulent and become quite turbulent and slow down more. Or it can switch to turbulent on one side. Alright, and that can push the ball in a certain direction. So you get these amazing examples where people actually have the volleyball and it seems to kind of just suddenly shudder or pause mid-flight, or it can even veer left or right, which makes for a really, really difficult serve to receive. So even the best volleyball players, when they're watching, sometimes they just make a misjudgment and completely not judge whether a ball's going in or out, whether they should go for it, or how to position their arms to receive it. And it's not because they don't have the skills to see it. Literally the ball suddenly changed in an unpredictable way. It didn't have a smooth flight path. It's hard to see all the time, but it's very effective. And that's because volleyball size things at about volleyball size speeds are somewhere near that boundary where laminar flow can turn to turbulent flow. If I wanted to put a slightly more scientific and full explanation on the boundary between laminar and turbulent flow, I would say you need to look up a Reynolds number. That's something that's really easy to see. It's basically a relationship between how far the fluid has to travel over a surface, how fast it has to travel over that surface before it's likely to turn turbulent. Okay? It's very, very hard to pin down the exact precise level. It depends on the tiny, minutest different things. If the air or water was dirty, whether the surface was dirty, whether it's smooth, whether there's a little scratch in it, something else that happened, a shudder, a vibration can suddenly change whether something turns turbulent, and then it tends to stay turbulent, at least for a while. But this is a really good guide that people use. So Reynolds number, look it up if you want to, but maybe I won't go into it too much further. Why do I labour the point around balls and laminar and turbulent flow? Well, it's because basically the only big exceptions you get from the drag equation occur when how much of which type of flow you have around a body changes. Okay, so if you have a transition basically between laminar and turbulent flow, this CD will change quite significantly. And you can see little plots that actually show that happening, right? There's certain points. And also, if you want to see where things change from normal subsonic flow, for example in flight, to supersonic, then CD changes quite a lot, okay? And that's because you go from having normal turbulent flow that covers the surface to basically a shock wave where the air doesn't really have time under normal conditions to kind of come back down onto the surface at all. It's shocked and kind of bounced off the edge of the surface itself. So these are the kind of transitions, the sort of regime changes that will actually change CD. But a lot of the time, once you're past this kind of change, it goes back to being a constant at much the same level, close enough to do useful calculations with. So that's why CD is really important. It's probably worth having a look at just the numbers for a moment, okay? So if you think about the Reynolds number, you can pretty easily calculate the Reynolds number for, say, an object that's 1 meter moving at 1 meter per second. So that's like a meter long thing moving at walking pace. It's going to have in air a Reynolds number something like 10 to the 5 because it's divided by kinematic viscosity. And that's like definitely enough to be turbulent almost all the time. So walking pace, meter long things are generally turbulent. Smaller things that are going faster than walking pace are somewhere near the boundary, like beach volleyballs, for example. But most military things are way bigger than beach volleyballs and often move a whole lot faster too, which means that you can rely really reliably. You can absolutely rely on the flow being turbulent, pretty much completely turbulent all the time. But I mention that because it's kind of the only gotcha which I think that people might come up with, say, oh, it might not be exactly squared all the time. It's true, but steer away from those circumstances which are pretty easy, and that won't be a problem. The other reason to go into that more, I think, than say shockwaves and supersonic speeds is because there's absolutely nothing that goes supersonic that doesn't say on the label that I'm meant to go supersonic, okay? Every kind of rocket and plane that can do that, that's a pretty clear thing they do. On the other hand, things that go really slow and things that have small appendages, for example, that might not be very big, they might have parts of them that sometimes stay laminar in flow. And that's potentially something to think about or ask about. Mostly, any decent sized body going certainly any faster than walking pace is going to have dominantly turbulent flow. That means the drag equation applies. That means you have to work with this really, really cruel squared relationship with the force required. Let's go back and do that quick calculation that we had before, right? That simple multiple choice question. The answer is really easy now. If you're going twice as fast, you need 4 times as much fuel to go the same distance. And if you're going half the distance, you still need twice as much fuel to cover that distance. Hope you got that right. That's really important and simple to get right. Okay, the third equation I'm kind of excited about because with just 2 equations, you can actually completely tie together the relationship between a vehicle's speed and how far it goes and its payload. With a third equation, you can also tie in its size and make really good estimations about how big, fast, and also a pretty good guide to how expensive the vehicle is going to be as well. Let's get stuck into it. Okay, so this third equation is simply this. It is the ratio between a body's volume and its surface area. It applies for anything. You can look at the formula for a cube, for example, and you'll find that it is simply r cubed. And also the same thing for a cube in terms of the surface area of it. It's going to be like it's going to have 6 sides, so you're going to have 6r squared. Same thing for a sphere. If you look at sphere, there's a cubed in the volume equation and there's a squared in the surface area equation. Now, this is really important because it actually applies to any shape. Any 3-dimensional enclosed body always has a cubed in the kind of defining length dimension of it in the volume and always has a squared in the surface area description. So why is that so important? Because it describes the relationship between how much drag you get on the outside because of the increased area as you get bigger and how much fuel you can fit inside the vehicle. Okay? Because as we scale things up, what we generally want to do is have more range or more payload or more speed or a combination of all those things. And we need to figure out that advantage. How far are you getting ahead in terms of how much internal capacity you have versus how much extra exterior drag you're encountering moving through the air or water? And the answer to that is that simply it scales with R, right? That same length dimension. As you get twice as big, your internal volume to surface area ratio gets twice as good. That's how it works. Right, let's do a simple little thought experiment. We'll take a vehicle that has a certain amount of its internal capacity devoted to payload, fuel, and power plant. And then let's just think about what happens as we scale that vehicle up, okay? We're going to try to do 3 different things and see how we get there. First, we want to see if we can double the payload. Then we're going to see if we can double the range. And then we're going to see if we can double the size. And we're going to keep the fraction of the internal volume that is taken up by power plant, fuel, and payload the same as we do it, and just see where we trip over those kind of achievements. How much bigger do we have to get to double those 3 different things? Okay, let's start. We'll start with the easiest one. The easiest one to double is actually payload. And that's because your payload scales with the cube of your length dimension. If you get just a little bit longer, you get to cube that little bit to figure out how much internal capacity you have. So you only need to go about 1.26 times as long, wide and high, and your payload is going to double. You get some other little advantages which will become clear in a second as well. Now, what about to double your range? Okay, now this actually requires that we have to be able to double the advantage of our fuel relative to our drag, which increases with surface area. Now, because the surface area scales with r squared and your fuel volume scales with r cubed, this is actually basically a linear relationship. So if you want to double your range and you keep the internal fraction of your fuel, power plant, and payload all the same, you need to double the length, height, width of your vehicle, and you'll be able to do that, guaranteed. Now, you're going to have some spare change in terms of the payload that you've got, and you can have some spare change in terms of the speed that you go as well. So you might be able to do better than that, but as a kind of rough reference, that's pretty useful to know. So the third one, of course, is speed. Basically, as you get bigger, your power plant power is going to go up with the cube of your internal volume. That's great, you're going up. However, as you do that, the drag that you get from going faster, that actually increases with squared, and the power you require actually increases with the cube law. So that means you've got to chase down this cube relationship as you get bigger. So you need to get bigger relative to the surface drag to chase this cubed relationship with speed. Okay, that's really hard to chase, and it turns out that you need to basically increase the size of your vehicle by your target, let's say a factor of 2 cubed, in order to have that power to surface area relationship also go up by a factor of 2. That is absolutely enormous, and that's basically why, like speed, it is the most difficult and expensive thing to obtain. In the theoretical marketplace of military technical trade-offs, a higher top speed, particularly a higher top speed that you want to use all the time, it's like gold or diamonds. Like a little bit of that, and you can get absolutely heaps of pretty much anything else. Now, if you look around at real-world objects, you look at various planes, you look at various submarines, and you look at how they scale and how it works, you might notice that things that go twice as far, they're not exactly like, twice in every dimension. And that's because of the extra things that I mentioned here in these numbers here. As you scale up, you also get a bit of advantage in all the other ones as well, all right? So if you've doubled your range, you're going to have quite a bit of extra payload. In fact, you're going to have 8 times as much payload. If you don't need that, you can trade off a whole bunch of your extra payload for more fuel, and you'll get a longer range thing with a relatively not quite so big vehicle. Okay, so there are trade-offs that all these different vehicles make in doing that, but the basic framework that you get is pretty simple to figure out, and this is a really handy reference to use. And it shows you really clearly why things that have to go extremely fast, like say rockets, ballistic missiles, they go up to Mach 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They have a tiny payload fraction. Basically what they do is they trade off as much of their internal volume as they can into their fuel and engine, and they just have a tiny bit of payload left. So they have to trade off an enormous amount of their payload in order to be able to have a big enough engine and fuel power plant, a fuel base to get there. And that's why it turns out they're extremely expensive ways of delivering things. That's why getting these into space is just so extremely expensive, because you have to move things really fast, and to move things really fast, you need a big thing with an awful lot of engine and a huge amount of fuel for a very small amount of payload. And that's what makes things expensive. Generally, the amount of engine and power plant you have is way more expensive in the vehicle than the fuel, and sometimes even the payload. So that gives you a really cool rough guide as to why things work out the way things work out. I hope that makes as much sense to other people as it does to me. I look around the world of military things that actually happen and happened in history and do happen in reality, and things just make so much more sense. This is why diesel-electric submarines go slow. This is why long-range drones have really wide wings that lets them fly slow, and they're relatively small and relatively cheap. This is why the SR-71 Blackbird, it doesn't go for very long and actually has less range than the U-2. This is why missiles are really expensive, and it's very hard to deliver a lot of payload through them. This is why you need a really big plane to get a lot of bombs dropped on target. This is why big things are more efficient for moving things in general. A really good one actually that I love coming back to is to think about shipping, because shipping is where the rules of economics apply to these relationships really directly. And as it turns out, these 3 equations are the perfectly necessary and sufficient explanation for slow steaming, and also why ships got really big. Shipping companies try to make as big a ship as can carry the stuff, as can fit through the canals and into the docking facilities. It's because the amount of stuff you get paid to move goes up faster than the amount you have to pay in fuel and machinery to move it. I'd like to talk about a similar and comparable acquisition where it was absolutely crystal clear that these equations were used and they were kept front of mind during the design and project construction phase. I think it's really important. I'm going to talk about the Virginia class submarines. I think this is an amazing, amazing project because if you look around the commentary around it, it's like one of the few projects that seems to have been delivered pretty much exactly on time, pretty much exactly on budget. They're still pumping out these remarkable and quite massive nuclear submarines for like $3 billion US, which is absolutely incredible to Australians who are used to hearing that each submarine is going to cost you like 7 or 8 billion Australian for a much smaller diesel electric one. So this is an impressive program by any stretch of the imagination. And its impressiveness, I think it stems directly from how sensibly well anchored the expectations were. This program, the history, it came from a post-Cold War need to make submarines a little bit cheaper. That's because the predecessor, which was the Seawolf class submarine, that was developed in a time when the Soviets basically had some incredibly fast submarines in the water. Things like the Papa class submarine, they could reportedly go up to around or a bit over 40 knots. They weren't quiet by any stretch, but they could streak around the ocean at speeds that make it pretty hard even to get torpedoes to catch up with them. So, the Seawolf was a bit of a response to a very, very high speed, if noisy submarine. The Seawolf is meant to be very, very high speed and extremely quiet. It does that with a fantastic pump jet propeller system and also a massive, very powerful, very well engineered nuclear reactor. How do we make things cheaper without making things worse? We still want a really good submarine, right? Or the US wanted a really good submarine. That's true. Now what they could do here, if they understood really well these three equations, they could figure out exactly what they had to trade off in order to get a certain amount of cost reduced. And that's, I think, a really, really smart way of approaching it. So there are basically two things the US Navy did to make the Virginia class cheaper than the Seawolf class submarine. First, and I won't talk about this too much, is they used a much less exotic blend of steel, which meant they couldn't go down quite as far. If they could trade off a little bit of depth and save a heap of money on the steel, that's an easy win, I suppose. They could weigh up the tactical consequences really simply and figure out that last couple of 100 meters is not worth the cost, and they made that decision. Good call. The second one, which I do want to dwell on, is basically they decided to trade off a little bit of the top speed in order to make a cheaper submarine. And this is really smart, and it looks really smart in hindsight because they knew which side of that really tough cubed relationship they were working from. Like I said, speed is like diamonds in the military technical trade-off space. Like, trade back a little bit of speed and you get heaps of pretty much anything else you want. And that's because of that extremely harsh cubed relationship between the power of your power plant and how fast you can go. So, what did they do? They said, well, if we can afford to give back a few knots of top speed, how much power does that reduce from the demands of our reactor? And if you've got a smaller reactor, not only is a smaller reactor probably cheaper, I suspect all the other engineering you have to do around the reactor to make a reactor quiet and make the reactor maintained and the systems that make it quiet, maintained, get a whole lot easier. Reactors, another topic for naval design. There are reasons why the amount of space actually constrains the things that you can do for a reactor to make it as quiet as possible. But I suspect they got a great trade. For example, let's flesh out the numbers on that just a tiny bit. If you were to say you wanted to reduce the top speed by something like 20%, let's just guess, the original speed of the Seawolf submarine might have been mid to late 30s, so you want to cut off like 6 or 7 knots from that speed perhaps and get it to around or just over 30 knots. In that case, a 20% reduction is basically going to mean you can get a 50%. You can almost cut in half the amount of power you need from your reactor at the top speed, and a 50% smaller reactor, that's going to be a lot easier to buy and maintain all the systems that keep it quiet. That's a big win. So that's one case where they had this cubed relationship, they knew what side of the cubed relationship they stood on, and they traded that, a little bit of speed, for an awful lot of savings around the power plant and the engineering surrounding it. So that's a smart one. The next thing they did was the next evolution of the Virginia-class submarine, which was basically driven out of modern needs to have more weapons that could get kind of close to China. Okay, they realized that China was starting to get very sophisticated anti-shipping systems, and they wouldn't be able to get probably big aircraft carriers and certainly not a lot of surface combatants really close to the Chinese coast. So submarines are pretty much the only way that you can have that kind of power projection under a pretty compelling A2 AD screen. So what do they want? They want to increase the payload, the amount of missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles they could fit in a submarine. And again, they basically could do that without changing anything on the submarine except giving up a little bit of speed. And they did this by simply making it a little bit longer. Okay, they added an extra, say, 15 meters, which is something close to around 15% extra length. That increases the surface area by almost exactly 15%. That increases the drag by almost exactly 15%. And with that 15% increase in drag, to reduce the speed enough to compensate for that, you only have to go back the square root of that 15%. So you only have like a 7% roughly. These numbers are all halfway made up, but they're quite indicative, I think. So to give back that little bit of top speed, they were able to basically better than triple the number of vertical launch tubes they had on the submarine. Again, it just seems like extremely smart engineering. They knew exactly which side of that squared relationship with speed they stood on, and they made a smart trade. Let's not up the engineering for all the reactor. Let's leave it the same engine, a little bit less speed, a lot more missiles. That's a great trade to make. And there's been almost no hitch. They've just kept pumping out these submarines, 2 per year from 2 different shipyards. No complaints, no massive industry walk-offs or protests from industry. It's been going as smooth and as slick as basically procurements ever go. This kind of smart engineering makes me really admire sometimes the US Navy. If they can keep making those kind of really smart trades again and again, they're going to be a formidable naval power for quite a long time. Let's start with what was the get-together story between France and Australia for the Attack Class Submarine. Well, to understand that, you really need to understand a little bit about the CEP, the competitive evaluation process. Australia only had a competitive evaluation process, which is different to the normal acquisition route, basically because Defence tried to overturn a captain's call that the Prime Minister at the time, Tony Abbott, made to pick Japan as the country to provide our future submarine. So Tony Abbott, interesting character in politics, he was kind of known for making these captain's calls, like just deciding with a little bit of executive authority that he was going to do this thing. What's a silly example? Like he gave, I think, Prince Charles some amazing Australian honours, like the closest thing we have to a knighthood, which Australians are kind of like, hey, he's a royal guy, he's got enough honours. What do you want about? That's so weird. He did it anyway. Prime Minister, he could, and he just made that call on his own. The submarines, the pick with Japan was kind of similar as well, and sort of seemed to come out of like a really close personal relationship that he had with Shinzo Abe, and he basically announced more or less of his own accord, without heaps of involvement from Defence, that we would get Japan to build our new submarines. Now, I think that a whole bunch of people in Defence were quietly fuming about that and wanted to find a way where they could build their own submarine their own way. They wanted, as some people have nicely put it, the boys' own Bonza submarine, something that was Australian built and we'd done kind of as much as possible on our own steam, and as many of our own guys were as involved in it as we possibly could have. So they put together this competitive evaluation process and lined up France, Germany and Japan together to try to see who was the best on a competitive evaluated process out of those three. Now, France was obviously one of these. The interesting thing is that out of those three, I think really, on paper, only Germany should have ever stood a chance. I mean, the next best one that probably actually should have had a chance was Sweden, who built the Collins class for us. So they had obvious pedigree. They still build diesel-electric submarines for their own navy. However, for some reason, they weren't invited. They were already ruled out before. I think there was pretty much an awkward breakup or a really difficult working relationship in the Collins class that Defence somehow still hasn't forgotten. So why do I say Germany? And I know lots of people are going to accuse me of being totally hopelessly biased about this. But the simplest objective fact to look at is that Germany still uses and relies on diesel-electric submarines for their own navy. And they've been pushing basically the envelope with a whole bunch of pioneering technologies like lithium batteries, like compass propellers that flex a little bit as they turn at higher speeds to try to delay the onset of cavitation. And also, their AIP is basically the best in the world, hands down. It's been bought and rebought by countries like Israel, like Singapore. Norway is going to get it. Basically, everyone now that orders a top-of-the-line submarine from Germany definitely gets this AIP system. There's been heaps in the water. They've been setting records for like well over a decade now for underwater endurance. So, in terms of just pure diesel-electric submarines, Germany is kind of the obvious one to beat. Sure, France exports a few since they've stopped making diesel-electric submarines for their own navy. They still export some to countries like Malaysia, Brazil, India, Chile, I think. But like, there's little swirls of, corruption stories that go after these each and every time. They're often delayed. I mean, just have a look at how the overall French-India project and France-Brazil deliveries are going, and weigh that up for yourself. Now, Japan actually, I think that Australia did probably the most reasonable and objective thing in ruling out Japan during the CEP. They are a country that has absolutely excellent submarines they've been building under their own steam since World War II, and they were evolved out of a US design from World War II that has this funny double hull. It wasn't funny back then. That was what every submarine had. They had a double pressure hull because welding just wasn't quite as reliable as it was these days. The Soryu class still also has this double hull for the front and the back, and there's an extended section in the middle that doesn't. And that just adds quite a bit of weight to it, or cramps down the internal volume that you can have for other things a bit. And it's probably not a critical disadvantage for Japan, but overall, it's not the kind of lean, mean sort of marathon running machine that Australia genuinely does kind of want for our submarine requirements, since we've got to go so far to get to theatre. So I think that and the fact that Japan, because of their pacifist constitution, has never exported really anything military before. It was always going to be a long ask for them to kind of try to export and build in someone else's country a new submarine in a hurry that was noticeably different from the one they already had. So I think, hands down, objectively, Germany was the one to beat. In terms of export capacity and handing over a domestically built production capacity, there is an incredible example in South Korea, and now Turkey, a very similar thing is happening, basically. South Korea is now building their own submarines evolved from German designs, but doing a whole bunch of things that are genuinely indigenous new ideas. They're putting vertical launch tubes and things like that in them. So they've now got a pretty reasonable, quite a credible, independent submarine capability built out of a long sort of heritage of building German submarines in South Korea. So really, the Australian thing to do at the time should have just been, hey, we want the best submarines, we want them in a hurry. Hey Germany, can you just do the Korea trick on us right now, really quickly, and can we have the top of the line, best technology that you will possibly share with us straight away? I think Germany would have said yes. But instead, because we were overturning a captain's call that came from Tony Abbott, we went through this competitive process, and to make it all competitive, we included 3 in the race, okay? And that included France. So, how did France come out on top of this? Well, to understand that, I think it's really important to let you in on this secret desire, this secret little want, this dream the Australian Navy and their submarine force has. Now, when I say secret, I don't really mean a total, complete secret. It's a secret that people don't write down or declare as something they really want, but you can kind of figure out on your own. To give you a cute little example, imagine like it's a teenager, someone who's like 15 or 16, going down to the street where there's this massive house party going on, a really big boozy event. What are they going there for? Well, officially they want to meet the neighbours and whatever else and have a nice time and socialise, but you can probably figure out also they would like to get a few drinks, please, because they can't officially do that at a pub or anything else, and get a little buzz on. Not surprising. So you can figure it out pretty easily. So Australia has this secret, not quite so secret, we can figure it out probably, wish for their submarines. They're wishing for speed. Of course, it's the most expensive thing in the military technical trade-off space to ask for, and they don't seem to know it. Now, how do we know that it's speed that they want in their transit? Well, there's a few ways we can know, and a few of them in the public realm you can point to easily enough. One is that Australia's submarine base is miles, absolutely miles from the Indonesian archipelago, which is the first realistic place where they might be deployed, and they might need to go a lot further than that. So they have a genuinely unavoidable, massively long commute to get into theatre. So as the first possible quality of life improvement that Australia's submariners would ask for, you would ask for a faster commute. That cuts down days or weeks off your deployment, or buys you more time on station, which has military and operational benefits. So it's an obvious and natural thing that you would be asking for too if you were an Australian submariner. The other reasons we have a little bit of an inkling that this was actually something that was seriously entertained in this program well after France was selected is that there's a couple of blog posts about that discuss the pump jet choice for Australia's submarine. Now, that came under quite a bit of criticism at various points, which I'll elaborate on later. But two different writers for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is Australia's main kind of quasi-independent think tank on defence and foreign affairs, two different writers actually floated that idea in blog posts of their own. And if I was defence and I knew there were advantages to the pump jet, or I thought there were advantages to the pump jet, which weren't actually winning in this public narrative about the pump jet, or they weren't out there yet, chatting to a few guys at places like ASPI and making sure that was something that people had thought of would be a pretty smart and logical thing to do. So these guys could have thought of that idea on their own and thought probably the pump jet helps at transit speed, or that could have also been linked out of defence. I don't really know, but I think there's a reasonable likelihood that that's probably what happened. Let's unpack the rest of the story. So if you have this hidden desire that you can't quite state, you don't want to state it because actually stating it clearly up front makes it less likely that your desire is going to get fulfilled and granted to you. So like imagine the kid at the party that's underage and rocks up and says, "Hey guys, I'm here because I would like some beer because I can't buy it at the pub or the bottle shop myself." They're going to say, "Hey, why are you here? You're 18. Who invited you anyway? That's not cool." And in much the same way, Australia's defence white papers have explicitly ruled out nuclear power time and time again in 2009, 2013, 2016. So being like, "Hey, I'd like to have a faster submarine, please." Everyone would be like, "Hey, you know that's a nuclear submarine. We've ruled that out. What are you talking about?" So there was a clear reason why you could harbour this kind of secret, unofficial wish, and you wouldn't put it out there, but it would still be something that you'd really, really like if you thought there was a way that you could possibly get it. So, the get-together story with France and Australia and the competitive evaluation process, basically like a kid entering a party and not asking for beers up front, but instead, I don't know, like picking up a bowl of chips and going around and trying to make a few friends and see who's nice and chat to them and see what they're up to and then drop some hints. That's kind of what Australia seems like they did through the CEP. Why would they, however, just settle in with France and figure out that they should chat to France and ask them whether they can squeeze out a few knots? Well, it's all because of this pump jet, which is a really crucial piece in this puzzle. Basically, France is the only country out of the three in the CEP that actually build nuclear submarines, and they're the country that builds nuclear submarines for their own navy. They've developed an apparently very, very good pump jet for their nuclear ballistic missile submarines, which is now being installed on their Attack Class or their Attack submarines as well. So they have a pump jet, no one else has a pump jet. And Australia had probably read the publicly available, quite reasonable and true reporting that says pump jets are good at high speeds and therefore they're more efficient and should probably be able to give you a bit of a relative speed advantage, right? Well, if you know these three equations, you can unpack that in a tiny bit more detail, because going faster, you might think you could obtain higher efficiencies as you go faster, but you actually have more work to do. So it's not just a question of how efficiently you can get the work done, but how much work is there to do when you're going faster. And when you're going faster, you have that little bit faster squared more work to do. And there's basically no chance in the world that an efficiency gain that you get from swapping propulsors will come close to making up for that additional cost that you bear for going faster. Now, I can see how this would appeal if you thought that actually it didn't take more force to go faster. You had much the same resistance at every other speed, and perhaps it was the propeller that was actually dragging you back at higher speeds that just started wasting more energy in the water. Now, if you had that idea and you thought there wasn't a fundamentally increasing drag force on the hull at higher speeds, this would be a great idea, an absolutely great idea. even if you thought the drag only increased linearly and there was a noticeable efficiency gain, this would still be something you'd test out. You'd be like, hey, it would cost us a bit more, but we could maybe take a bit of a bite out of that with this pump jet efficiency increase. Maybe we can see how much that is. But if you're chasing a squared relationship where just like, a 10 or 20% increase doubles or triples like when you square it, there is just absolutely no chance that you're going to be able to chase that through efficiency increases. None whatsoever. This is pissing into the wind if ever there was an instance of it. So, Australia doesn't seem to know that. Now, how do we know that they don't know that? It's an outrageous claim to think that Australia's technical, scientific, military advisors would not understand that drag forces increase exponentially with velocity squared. However, we actually have this incredible evidence that that's exactly what they think. And this came out in 2018. I was actually commissioned by an independent think tank to do some research into the pump jet. Other concerned citizens were really worried about this, so there was a bit of support to get some research done into it. And my report was picked up by a Senate inquiry. I was invited to go and give some evidence to the Senate on it, and the Senate was impressed enough with the report to direct defence to respond.
What's your response to the suggestion that we get a critique from the department as to the paper that's been presented to this committee? Is that possible?
I'm sure it's possible.
They asked Defence specifically to respond to this report. They gave them a date as well and said, make sure you respond well before the end of the inquiry, which is about 6 weeks away.
I'm sure it's possible, yes.
And we have a deadline in terms of the committee's reporting date. If you're conscious of that, would it...
And what would that deadline be?
The
27th of June.
So surely you would want something before that.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's the point. I would just make that... I'm not as humorous as you fellas, but they look pretty bloody stupid after the report's handed in, wouldn't it?
Defence, of course, missed that. They ignored the end of the inquiry, so there was no response included in the official inquiry into naval shipbuilding handed down. But about 6 weeks after that, finally this written response to a question on notice to the Department of Defence from the Senate of Australia gets an answer. And it looks kind of like this. It's basically like 6 pages of padding that reads sort of like a B-grade Year 8 science assignment. Here's a propeller, here's a pump jet, this is what it does. And then, in the very front page, front and center, there is this glaring, incredible, simple denial of the drag equation. They say here, the efficiency of a repulsor, pump jet or propeller, for a submerged submarine is related to the total submerged resistance and is essentially constants over speed. That's incredible. Absolutely incredible. They're stating here that they think it's essentially constant over speed. They do seem to have this delusion completely. If you want another source for that, we can actually see in 2017 there was another magazine article published by the Australian Defence Magazine that was interviewing basically the chief defence scientific advisor on this project. And in there's a quote that says, surface ships need to overcome wave-making resistance, which varies with speed. Their propulsors therefore need to be optimized for the required operating speed. When operating at off-design speeds, efficiency drops. Since submerged submarines do not have to overcome wave resistance, the efficiency of a propulsor can be considered independent of speed, and the aim is to design an efficient propulsor. There you have it. That is the same thing said differently by one of the chief defense scientists responsible for this project. This is a perfect example of someone taking like a little lick of the truth and a massive gulp of falsehood at the same time. On the boundary between two different fluids, it's true, you do get this extra wave-making resistance, and that isn't perfectly constant with speed. It actually still goes up, generally a lot, but there's a few ups and downs on the way up, and you should Google Froude number if you want to find out more about that. But basically, that's just part of the resistance, it's not all of the resistance, and still for ships, in the big picture, it's something like velocity squared almost all the time, except when you're going through different thresholds with the Froude number. Have a look at that if you want to. But for an underwater body, you just have the drag equation. In fact, I reckon that submarines are perhaps the postcard picture-perfect example of when the drag equation probably works best right out of the box. It's so big that the The drag is pretty much dominated by this lateral skin friction down the side of the hull, and that's going to be turbulent almost all the way. There will be a little section that might be laminar at the start, near the bow, but the rest of it is going to be turbulent almost certainly. So submarines are really where it works most perfectly. It's miles from all the big exceptions that you really need to worry about. So Australia has this secret wish. Let's figure out how that comes out in the CEP. They do sidle up to France, basically, and like a kid at a party asking for his cup to be filled with punch from that big boozy beaker over there, or asking for a couple of beers out of the esky, they say, "Hey, France, I hear you got this cool pump jet thing. Is there any chance we could squeeze like a few more knots into the transit speed and just get there like a bit faster? We hear that pump jets, they're more efficient at high speeds, and maybe they can help us like get there a bit faster. We know it's not a nuclear boat, but anything would be really great." Now, how does this request sound to French ears? What does a competent person think when they hear that request for an extra few knots? Well, they do the simple calculation that you and I can and will right now. What's your starting speed? It's probably something like 7 or 8 knots. Let's take, say, 8 for a starting point. How much more do they want? What are they hoping for? If they just want 2 extra little knots, that's already a 25% increase in the speed they're after, right? Now, the drag that they encounter actually increases with that 25% increase squared. That's 1.25 squared. And you're now already basically encountering a drag force that's 1.5 times what you had before, just by going 2 knots faster. Now, that drag increase has to be met by a fuel increase, because the definition of work, that tells you exactly how much fuel you're going to need. With that increase of needing like an extra 50% more fuel, if you take that and translate that to the batteries as well, which you would have to if you don't want your indiscretion rate to change a whole lot for the worse, then you need a massively bigger submarine. Now, you apply the third equation that we've learned today and figure out roughly how much bigger a submarine do we actually need, and that's relatively easy to figure out too. So all you need to do is figure out which one of these scaling up relationships applies here. Luckily, submarines tend to have quite a bit of excess capacity for diesel engines and motors, so they can do short sprints if they need to and snort quite quickly. More detail on that another day. So they don't actually need to increase at this cubed to the advantage you're looking for relationship. It actually scales just with this range equation. They need to get their surface area, they need to get their volume to surface area ratio to increase as much as that extra fuel or drag demand did. So for just 2 more knots, they need to get that to increase about 1.5 times, to be rounded down. 1.5 times, that's length and width and height. So the radius and the length need to increase roughly by 1.5 times. That's going to increase the overall displacement of the submarine by something like a factor of, 3.8. That is a massive, massive increase in the size of a submarine. Imagine saying you want a submarine nearly 4 times the displacement. It's not like the 1.5 times the displacement of the Collins we ended up with, but nearly 4 times. That is out of this world. And that's just if they asked for 2 knots. Now, it's true, it's quite possible that you might get a little bit of advantage from trading out some of the extra carrying capacity. You don't need to scale up the torpedoes nearly that much, so maybe you don't need so many of them. So the fuel fraction might be able to go up a bit as you went bigger, and you might not need to go quite that far. But overall, you can't go anywhere near that far with just 2 more knots. If you did this thing with 3 or 4 knots, let's go from 7.5 knots average transit to 11 knots. That increase is like 1.46. If you square that, you get well over a factor of 2. So at that stage, you need to more than double your length and your diameter. That's an absolutely crazy, out of this world transformation. It's probably bigger than most nuclear submarines already. So you only need to do those few calculations to realize what's being asked for by Australia is just off the charts impossible. Maybe they could get an extra half knot. Maybe they could squeeze out a knot somehow, but there is just no chance that you can scale up this submarine to achieve an extra 2, 3, or 4 knots on that length of transit without massive radical changes to everything else about the submarine, and certainly a huge reduction in its range. So, what does that mean for France? How would they respond to that? Well, there's a few things that they would think to themselves first. First, we just can't build our way out of this. We need it as big as possible and then some. and we certainly can't fit anything else in except just more fuel and batteries. We need to max out those. Nothing else can be included in this project that displaces any fuel and batteries. The second they'll be thinking is about that big ugly secret they've been harboring, and that is that pump jets, although it's true, they are actually more efficient at higher speeds. The higher speeds at which they become more efficient relative to propellers is probably more like 25 or 30 knots, or maybe 35 knots or 40 knots. It is certainly not more efficient at 10, 11, 12 knots. That is not where it's operating more efficiently. I've actually, in my research, encountered an absolute global expert and scholar on this topic who is willing to say there's pretty much no chance that a pump jet was more efficient below 18 or 20 knots. Almost no chance. And there is certainly the case, we know this very well, that as you get lower and lower and closer to zero, their efficiency falls further. So the French had this ugly secret. The pump jet was actually worse for efficiency, not better, at all the speeds that the Australians were requesting to go, and certainly at the slower speeds they would use on patrol. What do you do in a situation like that? Well, the French, this is what they would have done after that. After they had finished choking on their cheese and their French wine, they would have come back and said something like, sure, we can help you with that. Higher transit speed, of course we understand your totally unique requirements with a pump jet or a very efficient propulsion system. I'm sure we can find a way to meet your needs. Now, what they really needed to say after that was, please, let's not pin down exactly how we're going to do this. We can't commit exactly what speed you're going to reach yet until later in the design process. So why don't you join with us in a really deep partnership where we're going to team up and buddy up and do this whole design and development together. And every possible technology will be on the table and you'll be able to choose and have all the best access to every technology, and together we'll come up with something that I'm sure you'll really like. Now, that's pretty much what the French said. And we can see the evidence of this in this really over-the-top Australian contingent that was involved in the early stage design. Apparently it was almost equal numbers of French naval group engineers, naval architects in the early concept stages. They were matched pretty much by Australian hired naval architects and designers. And at the time, Australians would be all flattered by this because it says, oh, we're developing Australian capability. This is our submarine. It's going to be our capability. We're deeply involved and entrenched in it. We'll be better able to maintain it and design future ones in the future because of this. The French were actually having us on, getting us to come alongside and design this submarine together. That was just so that they could buy more time and hope that eventually Australia would realise that they had messed up their analysis, that they had no idea about these three equations. And it would be an Australian voice that chirps up and tells the admirals, sorry, you can't have more speed in transit. And by the way, you probably don't want this pump jet either. That's basically the big ploy. We can try something like that. I'm sure we can do something that really helps your unique requirements. But let's not pin down things too specifically. We won't announce or write down or commit to exactly what speed, because there's probably a bit of fine-tuning and things we need to do to work that out exactly. And they would have said, oh, but there's one thing you can lock in. It's going to be big. It's going to be real big. Let's say it's going to be the diameter of our nuclear attack submarine, which is a good step up. And by the way, don't pin down the length. We'll sort that one out. We might need to adjust it. Could be a bit smaller, could be a little bit bigger. So let's not pin that down. And of course, they would have said, okay, when we're going to deliver this, we're going to figure it out. Can we make the timeline long and vague? Because you're going to be designing this with us. You know, we're going to trust each other about us doing the right thing for you. And if that takes a little bit longer to work it out, I'm sure that it'll be because we're getting exactly what you require. And of course, all the technologies will be available, hoping desperately that Australia would see and analyse the comparison and what their requirements really were, and they would realise that the pump jet was not the way to go. The size had to be as big as possible, and that still probably wasn't going to be big enough, depending on what Australia finally was happy to settle for that extra speed, which France had tried not to promise, but egged on the hope that they could have some. Then, of course, there's the lack of air independent propulsion. I don't know of any other modern navy today that's not trying desperately to get AIP in their submarines. It's an absolute no-brainer. That's a topic for another show, but cut out AIP. The French couldn't obviously entertain anything else that wouldn't be as energy dense as more diesel and the batteries needed to accompany them. And of course, there's this really odd teaming arrangement where heaps of Australian or Australian hired people were hired to go and work alongside in this kind of tight-knit, doing it all together collaborative arrangement with Naval Group in Cherbourg. And of course, there's the timeline and budget. They were both big and vague. Bigger than anyone expected and way more vague than anyone could, poke a stick at. That's kind of the get-together story about how Australia and France landed in this partnership. And you can see pretty easily how that's going to get really awkward really soon. And it does. And we know roughly the point when it became suddenly really, really awkward. And that's the point in 2017 at the Pacific 2020 Naval Expo. And basically, Jean-Michel, the chief of DCNS at the time, or Naval Group, they'd already changed their name, he came out and basically said, when asked by a journalist, and said, oh no, it might not be a pump jet, it could be something else. And that, of course, did set the cat amongst the pigeons, and that was what triggered all this commentary and analysis by people like myself, by people like Andrew Davies and others that were saying, what's going on here? Why is it the pump jet? Are they actually as inefficient as people are sometimes saying, including myself, or is there some other reason that they might have chosen this pump jet? That comment generated a lot of commentary. However, it also generated a massive pushback from the politicians leading the project. Christopher Pyne, of course, was the defence minister at the time, and he dug his heels in. I don't think the French were expecting that. I had given some evidence recently to a Senate inquiry about this, and I had heard the government's response and called it out as really being unimpressive, and let a few journalists know, not many of whom picked up on it. But in an interview a couple of days later with Andrew Bolt, Christopher Pyne said about me, no, he's completely wrong. The Naval Group and Department of Defence have responded to it, and it's just right. Just trust me on this. And so he's dug his heels in and says he doesn't want to listen to me at all. But that meant that now Australia had backed themselves into this corner where they were forced to accept the pump jet. They were going to take it because it now had political backing right from the Defence Minister, who basically was trying to lash back at people like me who are questioning what's going on. Maybe that's starting to sound just a little bit awkward. Okay, so how do we also know that the awkwardness was getting really, really serious? Well, it's not hard to tell that at some point, more and more designers, as the design progressed, were going to start trying to figure out where all this extra speed was going to come from and trying to ogle up how the fuel demands would be met and how the machinery would still fit in and everything else like that. Now, this kind of process, it happens through a series of stages. Sometimes they can be pretty quick, particularly if you genuinely are working from a submarine you already know how to build and you have a sensible set of requirements. But in this case, they were stepping through every single gate nice and slowly at a good plod to really design the whole thing ground up. Let's get to this process. How do we actually see the submarines progressing? Very hard. Defence was extremely cagey, totally non-transparent. The best we really have is this document from the Australian National Audit Office. And there's this summary, this really light little summary called the schedule performance that's given at the executive summary in this document. And here they basically give one of the most awkward, stilted, difficult to read, difficult comprehends couple of paragraphs of work I've ever seen. It jumps from awkward fact to simple fact to something else unexpected without the slightest attempt to thread through actually what's happening, whether any of this is bad, whether it should be going like that, whether people were upset or what was going on with it. It is just the most bland, odd, stilted, confusing repetition of facts that were given by defence. It's quite obvious that's it. Have a read, it's quite amazing. But to have a little look at it, there are actually a couple of key dates they do mention and include. So there's various different stages of design and design a little bit further when they're trying to basically figure out from the overall high-level requirements to actually lock in more and more detail till you're really getting down to the brass tacks of exactly what machinery, exactly how fast it all turns and how big it is, how hot it gets, and whether the ship can work and how the ship will work to achieve what requirements. So basically, the story this tells is the different stages of those studies start to slip back and start to have delays. So the concept studies review, that was completed late. And also the functional ship systems requirement, which is another level of detail, that was scheduled for the 31st of October 2019, that didn't happen at that time. However, they were confident they would make it up in time for the next one, which is really where they start to lock things down into a pretty good level of detail. And that's the Functional Ship System Functional Review. And that apparently happened in January 2021. Now, interestingly, when you start to bottle things together, someone would have realized that this submarine design wasn't coming up with all the speed that they were promised or they were expecting. And I'm sure there would have been some eyebrows raised and a very awkward relationship in all the offices about whose fault it was and where this was coming from and why the efficiency wasn't what we thought it was. And that would have been awkward as hell. But, of course, right on schedule, that January 2020 is pretty much exactly when Scott Morrison realizes this is no longer going to meet our requirements and starts asking around all his mates, like the US and the UK, is it possible that you can help us with a submarine? Now that's really pretty amazing. Let's just go and have a little look at what Scott Morrison said. So, the Prime Minister of Australia, in trying to explain AUKUS and all the massive political backlash there was from France, said that in a dinner that he had with the President of France, Macron, he said they would agree to disagree that the attack class would not meet our requirements. Now that is an absolutely incredible bombshell admission, because if the attack class would not meet your requirements, what was it that you agreed would meet your requirements when you finished the competitive evaluation process like 5 years ago? That's absolutely incredible, because it's pretty much a bland admission that they didn't know that the attack class could not meet their requirements when they first signed on to it. It's absolutely incredible. No one else in the media seems to care about this, but that is just shocking that, they thought there was a requirement that would be met at the time, and it was the unofficial speed one, and only now, about 5 years and $2.5 billion later, are you realizing that requirement would not be met. Absolutely mind-boggling stuff. So the final piece of the puzzle that you really want to pull together is, how does this explain the breakup? The amazing, spectacular, awkward, politically incredible, with ambassadors recalled around the world, breakup of the French-Australian submarine program. Well, to do this, I think it's worthwhile pulling out another cute analogy. Imagine France had taken out Australia to a brilliant, massive big ball, a total gala event, and France had won this rather prestigious and very lucrative opportunity to take Australia out to that fantastic big event. Now, everything was going kind of okay, except that there was something really awkward, actually downright embarrassing, that was just a lingering, horrible, awkward embarrassment that nobody in the room could seem to talk about. Imagine the beautiful dressed up girl going to the ball. She looked great, her hair was done perfectly, everything was awesome, she was smiling radiantly, except she had just one gross, embarrassing flaw. Imagine a horrible piece of snot just hanging out of her nose that you couldn't quite see or feel, but everyone else could see it. In fact, once they'd seen it, there was nothing else that you could unsee. So, in that sort of situation, the ball's going to proceed and it's going to go okay for a little while, and France, because they're being paid brilliantly to be there, is going to keep swanning around saying as best they can. They can't actually tell the girl, hey, why don't you go to the bathroom and sort that stuff out, because that gross big embarrassment, not knowing the basic equations that meant your expectations were completely based on reality, that's the only reason you got chosen in the first place. So you just have to zip it, say nothing, and just smile and just keep on dancing, keep having fun, keep the wine flowing, and hope that things turn out alright. Now, of course, France was hoping things would turn alright, but things eventually got a little bit awkward. Australia, dancing around the room, having a nice time. People didn't seem to want to dance that long or have her in that many photos or something like that. Things were a little bit strange. And anyway, eventually, she goes to the bathroom just for natural causes, and eventually, realizes this absolutely horrible embarrassment. We can't achieve what we wanted to with our submarine. So that gross source of embarrassment is revealed painfully. France at this point is kind of well, I'm sure she's going to sort that out, suck it up, put on a brave face, come back out here and finish the ball and dance the night away with me. Because, hey, I'm the one that brought her in here and did everything right. Now, that's what I think the French were expecting all along. And who can blame them? That's the best possible outcome. You're not going to walk away from a submarine deal for 12 submarines for $50 billion very lightly. So that's what they were hoping for. But what they didn't realize is that Australia would do something totally unexpected. In the bathroom, absolutely shocked and embarrassed at what they've discovered, cleaning it up. They don't just go back out there with a brave face. They call their friends. They get on their phone and say, hey, this party is awful. I don't want to be here. I'm upset with this guy. Can you please come and get me now? Why don't you just also, hey, bring me a skirt and some flat shoes. Let's go dancing at nightclubs because I hate all this formal stuff. And you know what? The US and the UK picked up the phone and said, yeah, sure. Of course. We'll come get you. Be right there. See you outside in like 5. Australia waits 5 minutes and then comes out. Walks straight out the door and says in front of everyone, hey guys, enjoy the rest of your ball. I just decided I don't like this sort of stuff. I'm going to go clubbing with my friends because that's what all the cool kids are doing anyway. So see you later. I'm out. And that's what they did. So that's basically why France was left here with no explanation. Absolutely kind of seemingly shocked, but actually Australia was pretty relentless and be like, no, I'm not that sorry. I'm not going back. I definitely don't want to buy a nuclear submarine from you, because they'd had this embarrassing, painful relationship. To be like a decent friend, you would expect the guy to be like, you know, when he was picking her up in the car, or just a moment later as soon as they arrived, hey, just go and check your makeup, or like offer a handkerchief. Didn't do that. France couldn't do that because without the pump jet, more efficient, higher transit speed myth, there was no chance that they would win that submarine competition. So they had to keep that going. But yet, the rest of the world was kind of surprised too, because like, as the car tears away and goes out to the clubs, like the Americans, the Poms are kind of like, wow, that French guy is totally mad. You didn't like just go and give him a kiss goodbye and say thanks for picking you up and everything like that. That's totally odd. And it was odd. But there's a reason for that too. Australia absolutely did not want to go and talk to that guy and did not want to discuss in public the source of the embarrassment. That was something they wanted to forget. And Australia still does. Australia still doesn't want to admit that it was them that stuffed up the expectation and got cuddly with France in this relationship because they thought that they could get a submarine that delivered something that was basically scientifically impossible, and you could verify it's scientifically possible in just a couple of minutes, as we did before. So that basically is a short summary of why I think it's absolutely essential. Anyone in defense, anyone talking about defense issues, they know at least these 3 equations. Make sure you know the definition of work, the drag equation, and the volume to surface ratio of any enclosed body, because that will help you out a lot. Now, when I reflect on the Australian submarine story, I do kind of think to myself, what I just said sounds like a pretty massive allegation, and it is. And to be honest, it amazes me too. It really amazes me that there could be that kind of depth, seemingly of incompetence that could allow such a simple, glaring problem to persist, and a narrative that should have been quashed in like just a couple of minutes can carry on for 5 years and waste several $1 billion of taxpayers' money and leave our defense position in a way weaker state than it would have been, because we need those submarines. We need new submarines in the water, and we've just had another false start, a 5-year false start this time. That's not good news for anyone. How did we get here? How did we possibly get here? I don't know the answer to that completely, and there are basically 2 ways that can happen. I think that one way is the incompetence route. There is enough incompetence and pure incompetence and deep incompetence that whoever got hold of this information, none of them knew. No one was smart enough to call this out. No one could actually say, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Let me do a head check of that. What was the reason again? Why are we going there? No one could call it out. So we would have to be pretty purely and completely and deeply incompetent for us to make this mistake for so long before we realized what's going on. Particularly since, actually it was back in like years ago, I think it was in 2012, that Australia first had a senator ask about the pump jet, and Australian defence officials promised that they would actually look into it properly and do the research before making a decision about it. So, what's the alternative proposition? I actually know there are plenty of extremely competent people in the defence establishment, certainly in uniform. There are people that I meet in the services who are absolutely impressive, and I know I've spoken to people that laugh and are amazed as well at what defence seem to have said and done about this resistance issue. It's quite incredible to them as well. So there's an alternative hypothesis other than the deep and pure incompetence. The other one is that we actually have quite a few pockets of genuine and real competence. Or maybe not just pockets, maybe it's mostly great people and great competence, and there's just a few people there that are maybe a really bit subpar. And in this case, for that to be likely, there would have to be some kind of arrangement where people were able to guide this project out of the way of the competent people who would have called this out, and put it in front of the people who were not smart enough or not bold enough to actually call a cat and say what's going on. And in that case, basically the program is at least a little bit corrupt. Now, I don't want to put a label on exactly what corruption has to be. It doesn't have to be briefcases full of cash or the promises of like a massive chalet in France and infinite skiing holidays. It could be something simple like just a promise of a promotion or the promise of some lucrative defense industry job when you retire. It could be other things like that. It could just be a way of saving face and avoiding admitting your own mistakes. But basically anything that I think public officials do that can't be justified as being in the public benefit, that is corruption. And it seems to me that an alternative hypothesis is that at least some of that was necessary to thread the information and authority to call out this kind of issue between all the competent people and make sure it only landed in the laps of kind of, well-credentialed idiots that weren't quite strong enough to call out a cat as a cat and make the appropriate stink that's required to quash this kind of thing. I don't really know exactly where on the spectrum it lies, but either one absolutely terrifies me. Either one is terrible for the defence of Australia. And either one, certainly, if I was in the position of the UK or the US right now, and thinking about how you're going to partner with Australia to develop the nuclear submarines, I'd be massively, massively, deeply concerned about what I got myself in for, unless Australia figured out their own backyard and sorted out what's going on with their own defence establishment. If you know anything else about what is the version that's true here, is it deep and pure and complete incompetence, or is there at least a bit of corruption helping to thread it between the generally competent people and make sure nobody can call this out? I would love to hear from you. I think the nation needs to hear from you. Please contact me, contact someone else, and let people know what actually went on with the Attack Class Submarine. If even a little bit of this story is close to the truth, we have something of an emergency on our hands, and the government needs to be held to account so they can fix it and they can build the submarines that we really need for our defense. Thanks very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and also hit the bell button so you get notified when there's a new video. Thanks very much.